The writing of history is probably one of the most studied topics of early and high Middle Ages. We devote our best abilities to understand the work of medieval historians. We ask how shared memory creates a sense of belonging.
Marie?
Yes, of course you want to.
Sorry. Yeah, we'll just let everybody in. We'll get started in just two minutes. Sorry.
Sorry, I saw that your microphone was off.
Oh.
So sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Sorry, we'll just one minute, and then I'll explain how everything works. I think we're probably. It'll be good to go. Alice, is everybody shuffled in? I think. Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody to the first IHR seminar of the new term, and it's a great pleasure to kick things off with one that's actually, I think, rescheduled from late last term, actually, with bringing to our seminar here Marie-Céline Isaïa, who is Maître de Conférence at Lyon 3. Marie-Céline is well known to us as the author and editor of a number of books and edited volumes on early medieval cultural and religious history. I know many of us will know her fantastic work on, particularly on the cult of Saint Remigius of Reims in her book, 2010 book, Remy de Reims. She's also got a number of ongoing projects and upcoming publications, quite a few, been very productive and busy recently. So among these, coming I think quite soon with Brepols, I think you said, is a book from the first book from a project called Liberté de Parole, freedom of speech, which was the results of a comparative and interdisciplinary study that Mary co-directed with Makram Abbé, and that was on looking at the contribution of religious elites to the criticism of government in Islam, Byzantium, and the Latin West. I think there's a second part of that she's also working on. And then, excitingly, in the autumn, her habilitation will be appearing in published form under the title Une autre histoire, Histoire trompe et passée dans la vie et passion latine. And that's coming out through the Bibliothèque d'Histoire des Textes in the autumn. So that will be very exciting to see as well. She's also working on, or she's recently completed editions and translations of works of Agobard of Lyon for Source Chrétienne, and with Michel So, Einhard's translation of Saints Marcellinus and Peter for the Belles Lettres series. Both of those should appear next year. Today she's speaking on something different, perhaps something that will appear in the habilitation later, but she's going to be speaking to us on the writing of history, not why, but how, the Chronicle of Ado of Vienne. And just before you get going, Marie, I'll just to reiterate to everyone, for those who aren't familiar, what we'll do is we'll obviously hear Mary's paper, and at that point, the chat box will be opened. If you would like to ask a question, then either put in there question, raise hand, and I'll call on you. If you'd like to type your question in the box, that's fine too. But obviously, it's great if you just want to come on and say it for yourself. But without further ado, Mary, over to you.
It's a very great privilege for a researcher to reach such an audience. So I would like first to thank all the organizers, Alice, of course, who invited me first, and Ed for these kind words, but not also because Ed was kind enough to proofread my presentation. So if you see no spelling mistakes or grammar mistakes, you can thank Ed. And as you've already gathered, I'm French, so I can't speak English. I only speak scientific English. So I apologize if it's too painful. And when it becomes very too painful, just imagine that it is far worse in German. So it's about the writing of history and the efforts all us historians we devote to scrutinize all these texts to decipher how these authors created a sense of belonging or a political loyalty. An historian after another, Freckles, Fredegar, Flodorades, adopt remains. Are we talking about collective historical knowledge and culture, or are we talking about the practice of smart individuals? I mean, to catch a glimpse of the historical culture of any monk of the 8th century, can we rely on Bede? And to improve our knowledge about how a 9th century cleric considers the past, is it sensible to read Hincmar of France? If we want to understand not a singular historian, but the historical culture of a wider stratum of society, we must find another range of documents. We need narratives very close to historical narratives, but numerous enough to bear statistical analysis. We need works not always produced in the major cultural political centers. We need texts whose purpose is the telling of the past, with the clear ambition of telling the truth. Hagiography is a good candidate. It is even the best possible candidate if we begin with acknowledging the major differences between hagiography and history. History certainly composes the past with the present in mind, but hagiography goes far further, for it wants to manifest the present virtues of a saint who is not only an actor of past history, but a person still alive in God's eternity. Hagiography and history are never, or almost never, gathered in the same medieval manuscripts, since they are not used in the same contexts. They sometimes meet around question of memory and exemplarity, but over the long period of early and high Middle Ages, they are never mixed up. Yet, if we start focusing on social uses and genres and start observing authors, writers, intellectuals who compose all these texts, the issue gently unravels. Hagiographers do not come out of the blue. They are students, they are readers, they are Christians. They share a whole culture with their peers. They compose their vitae with the specific tools one learns at school, as historians also do. Under specific conditions, their knowledge of the past could reflect the common knowledge of the scholars of the same generation. And with nearly 700 biographies written from the first Passiones to the 11th century, hagiography certainly offers a basis large enough to give some results. And the results are fascinating. Until the 8th century, hagiographers slightly care for saints who died long ago. Just think about the vitae written in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, that is on the left. With the exception of Pope Gregory the Great, saints do not emerge from a remote past. They are people your parents could have met, people the elders can tell you about. The same experience applies to Germany with Anglo-Saxon missionaries on the right. This temporal proximity is a requisite of hagiography. Since the first vitae of confessors, the task of being witness to their achievements is devoted to disciples, friends, or admirers of the saint. The rule is that the shorter the distance, the better the testimony. But the rules change all of a sudden in the same geographical context of Carolingian Germany on the left. Hagiographers of the 9th century do not hesitate no more to narrate the life of a saint they have not known personally. The monastery of Fontenelle in Normandy on the right even shows a coordinated effort to give Merovingian saints their vita more than a century after their death. And if we turn to contemporaneous Italian hagiography, that is to biographical texts written in Italy under the Carolingian rule from 750 to 880, we have 68 passiones and vitae and only 2 vitae devoted to contemporary saints. Thus, 97% of Italian hagiography of the 8th and 9th centuries talk about a very distant past. Jumping over the Lombard period, nearly all these texts narrate the antique past, the Roman imperial persecutions, the struggles of saintly bishops for the defense of the true faith against heretics. It is partly a matter of tradition. In Italy, the memory of the martyrs prevails. Partly also a matter of eager Carolingian concerns about the Roman imperial past. During the Frankish rule over Italy, authors begin to show more interest in the antique church history and especially in the economical councils. During the first half of the 9th century, saints of the 4th century become very fashionable. So the rules of the hagiographical composition changed between the 8th and the 9th century. As hagiographers show very deep and new interest for the most antique past, for their seminal past, they have to adapt their methods. First, Carolingian scholars develop an expertise in chronology, thanks to Bede. His Liber de Ratione Temporum has well-known effects on the writing of history, like the appearance of the Anno Domini in Minor Annales under the Pipinid rule. The same phenomenon can also be highlighted in hagiography. In texts traditionally deprived of any date, the era of incarnation stands front and center during the 9th century. Lyon of Saint-Denis acts as a specialist of chronology when he speaks about the moment of Saint-Denis' death. You've got the text on the picture. Lyon, who writes under Louise Pierce, has calculated these dates that appear nowhere in previous texts about Denis. Thanks to Bede's Chronica, he knows Anno Mundi, the dates of Titus and Domitianus, and he converts the result of his calculation to find the date Anno Domini for the death of his saint patron. The Christian era is the perfect tool when you pretend to write about a saint who died 5 or 7 centuries ago. For when you know such a universal date, you can connect a saint with his contemporaries, emperors, kings, princes, abbots, saints. Even if your character never appears in written records, a simple date helps you to delineate a likely context for his existence. Here is a second major change in the author's methods. Fontanellensis hagiographers read their own charters to identify under which Merovingian king their saints live. They also read previous hagiographers and previous historiographers, doubting no more their capacity to gain a fair knowledge of the past, even without any oral tradition. Thus, hagiography of the 9th century heavily relies on borrowings from historical narratives, hagiographers proudly claim how skilled they are in investigating these narratives of the past. Just listen here to the beginning of the first life of the Bishop of Vercelli, Eusebius. The anonymous hagiographer does not shyly protest his incompetence. On the contrary, in this first work, we have written what we have learned from the histories and chronicles of illustrious men. This hagiographer actually uses the Latin Historia Tripartita of Cassiodorus. If we broaden the focus and consider the whole vitae written during the 9th century and published in the Monumenta Germania Historica, 28% embed noticeable extracts from chronicles or histories. My study goes further, and the book to be published continues till the 11th century. But if we stop here, during the second part of the 9th century, hagiography had already succeeded in showing us a very clear description of what I call the historical culture of this time. Authors are confident about their ability to reach the remotest past, especially the antique one. They read and quote historians to learn about this past. They are able to select between different historians which past suits their aims and beliefs the best. When they know more about the actors and events of the past, they use chronology as a tool, for dates help to connect contemporary actors, to show previously unseen links. The knowledge of the past is not by itself their major goal. These intellectuals write a more global history with their sense of particular case within the divine purpose. During the second part of the 9th century especially, they are less concerned by ethnical histories and more by church history. If my first assumption is correct, if hagiography is a good revealer of the historical conscience, training, and culture of intellectuals, then all these criteria must also appear in some of the historical writings of the same period. We must find at least one Carolingian history that teaches the Lord's purpose within human history, a history with a strong chronological frame, a history that heavily relies on previous historians, and Ado's Chronicle is definitely the most impressive mirror of a substantial part of these Carolingian historical concerns. Ado was a monk, first in Ferrières and in Prüm, but came to live in Lyon when he has the Earl of Vienne as a protector, a certain Girard of Vienne, who asked for Ado's promotion as a bishop of Vienne. As an author, Ado was first concerned with the huge historical martyrology that he completed when in Lyon. The martyrology is the first token of Ado's interest for the past, for church history, for compilative knowledge, and the first occasion he found to prove his ability to pick elements here and there and to put them in order. When Bishop Ado then wrote the Chronicle that is here under scrutiny, and no wonder he also composed shortly after two vitae about saints with strong ties to his bishopric. Let me introduce you to the Chronicle. This is my vision of Ado's Chronicle. That is a text given by the Patrologia, but colored to highlight the work done by Ado when he compiled these documents. The Chronicle is a wondrous universal history that suffers till now of a lack of modern erudition. It has no scientific edition indeed, but is only faulty printed in the Patrologia, according to the one and only edition of the 16th century. To give you a good picture of the problems, misspellings and misprints, just imagine that in this only edition available, Philip II of Macedon is called a holy king. An opponent to the horrible Hebrew I sinks in the sewers when the Liber Historia Francorum mentions his escape to Lyon. Peter the Apostle does not fight Simon the magician, but Simon the Great. The Nicene Council takes place in 322, and Charlemagne dies in 863. Ado is not to be held accountable for such inaccuracies. Mistakes are not the worst problem. Because of a lack of scientific addition, there have been no serious try to understand the very composition of the work since the thesis of Wilhelm Kremers. Hence, misunderstandings, as some papers only repeat what Kremers said about the use of Enoch's Vita Caroli, of Augustine, or of the Historia Tripartita. Ado's use of these texts are at best anecdotal and chiefly non-existent. Hence the need to patiently read the Chronicon and identify its sources to have the privilege to discover the clever and complete historiographical scheme. Ado renews a tradition interrupted after Isidorus' deed. To write his universal Chronicon, he splits the word history into 6 ages, from Genesis to the great floods and to Abraham, David, and so on. And I drew a blue line between one age and the next and wrote its number. You naturally read from the left to the right and from top to bottom. The 4 first ages only represent about 20% of the whole work, and more than half of it relates events of the 6th age, that is after incarnation. The arrow in the last page points when Ado stops, before the first continuation that the Patrologia has added according to the manuscripts. For Ado has not ended his work with the death of a king, nor with the rise of a new kingdom or any decisive battle, but with the current year during the reigns of Charles the Bald and Louis of Italy. Indeed, it does not aim at a national nor at a local history. It talks about every kingdom under the rule of Carolingian offsprings as it is here and now. In the manuscript of the Chronicon, now in Cambridge, a scribe gives his own vision of the actual content of the work. The scribe does not name the kings, but mentions by a very comprehensive expression the sons of Louis the Pious. It is not what Ado wrote verbatim. You can compare here the 2 texts, but it eventually looks like what Ado meant, not the history of a regnum, but all the historical events he can grasp for a given period of time. The medieval readers of Ado perfectly understood that his Chronicon was by essence without an end, because it is not a dynastic history, but a Chronicon that is literally a history of time as it passes. So they began to complement it, then altered its very nature when the Chronicon became the kernel of Francia Occidentalis history. In a manuscript from the Loire Valley within the sphere of influence of Fleury, when Fleury had become the first historiographical center of the Capetian dynasty, some additional additions close the Carolingian part of this history and link it to the Capetian part. This appears as the second continuation with orange arrows. But Ado had definitely not contemplated a dynastic history. Rather the contrary, if we read his actual last sentence, King Charles had 4 sons by Queen Ermengarde. 2 of them he consecrated to God, but an untimely death took away Lothar, and Charles, who had already been appointed king of Aquitania, died after dishonorable wounds. Here is the clearest possible answer to the matter of the political purpose of the bishop. Ado is generally complimentary about the first Carolingian kings, but he has never written to support their rule. His history has no dynasty to blame, no prince to promote. It expresses no Frankish pride. In this respect also, Ado is representative of a certain ecclesiastical point of view, with the ecclesia as the one and only noteworthy political scale. The organization of his oeuvre is eloquent enough to his very purpose. Ado writes a history of the whole world as the Lord leads it. That is a narrative that stresses the importance of the biblical past, then of the Roman past, then of the Frankish past, because all these steps resolve within church history. And within this universal ecclesiastical history, it does not even claim a prevailing role for his bishopric of Vienne. Perth's limited edition of the Chroniconism in the Monumenta has indeed done a disservice to historians. Perth explains that he has selected only the facts specific to Vienne, as no one can find them elsewhere. Thus, an edition of less than 7% of the full text that collects bits here and then and artificially creates a Viennensis chronicle. The goal of Ado was far different. He certainly quotes the names of his predecessors, obviously depending on the list of the bishops of Vienne. But if we consider that he could have written Gesta Episcoporum or Liber de Viennensis Episcopibus, Ado looks both modest and ambitious. Modest, for it does not promote chauvinistic assumptions, nor pretend that Vienne has precedence over many churches, nor celebrate its exceptional patrimony, but ambitious also because it encompasses a real universal history where Vienne takes its place, no less, no more. Just look at the limited space devoted to Bishop Mamertus. Such a quotation reveals the exact weight of Vienne, whose importance in the Chronicon is certainly nor surprising nor pivotal. The same quotation is far more interesting for the work it reveals. Ado has picked the various elements of his history in bead in yellow, in his own martyrology in orange, in the Chronica of Isidorus in grey, and in the Liber Historiae Francorum in green, and in the De Veriis Illustribus by Jerome in red. Actually, as you have already seen, almost the entire Chronicon can be colored, that is linked with its source. Some sources look more prominent than others, like Orosius in green or the Annales Regni Francorum in blue. My choice of color is not the best possible, but as it imperfectly stands, the picture shows that Ado has interweaved 6 main historical sources: Orosius, Jerome, Isidorus, Bede, the Liber, and the Royal Annals, with exegetical commentaries written by 2 authors, Rabanus Maurus and Quodvuldeus. Such a picture does not sufficiently reflect how intricate is the work of Ado. But for 1 or 2 pages of Orosius alone, Ado never copies a page without stuffing it with quotations from another author. And when he copies, he selects one sentence after another, rewords and rewrites. In the 6th age, for example, there are more than 40 quotations taken from Isidorus, more than 75 distinct paragraphs borrowed from Bede, and so on. With the same code of colors applied to a single page, we are here somewhere during the 4th century, you've got a little taste of the work done, Bede, Liber, Jerome, Bede, Ado, Bede, Isidorus, Bede, Ado, etc. In green, the Liber Historia Francorum is significantly abbreviated. As these historical texts do not document all periods equally, they are not used at the same time. Bede holds a special place, for his Chronica gives Ado the chronological frame he needs all the way. Isidorus plays a similar role, but with a lesser intensity, and as a matter of fact, Isidorus is rather useful for the insights he gives on Visigothic history. The fundamental role devoted to Bede is not surprising at all. At the end of the 8th century, a text known as the Chronicon Universale had already been created according to the same method. The anonymous author of the Chronicon Universale supplies Bede's Chronica with events mentioned by Gregory of Tours to give the text its Frankish hue. The method is effective but rudimentary. You find here a sample of his style with notes taken in Bede, interspersed by a fragment of Gregory of Tours, DLH for Decem Libri Historiae. The whole paragraph composes a compendium of what happened under the rule of the Emperor Anastasius. But Ado's work is far more ambitious and complex. It needs 5 authors to compose the same compendium about Anastasius' time, B for Bede, I for Isidorus, G as Gennadius, A stands for Ado himself, who has created his own biography of his predecessor, Avitus, thanks to records and remains he found in Vienna, here Avitus' epitaphs. His work cannot be seen as a simple copy-paste technique. It reflects a very comprehensive effort to collect every detail he can grab. There are several elements here that deserve comment. First, Ado's marked interest in heresies. I will come back to this. Then the choice of texts like the Liber Historiae Francorum instead of Gregory of Tours, or like the De Viris Illustribus. Why has Ado chosen these sources? We cannot only reply that these were the available manuscripts in Vienna. When Ado wrote his martyrology, he thoroughly read Eusebius' Historia Ecclesiastica, but there is no evidence of Eusebius' presence in the Chronicon. Ado most likely had also the history of the persecution in Africa by Victor Vita, with no discernible sign of use in the Chronicon. It is not enough to say that Victor Vita is not a widespread author, obviously, as he quotes Quod Vuldeus Carthaginiensis. Ado does not exactly look for commonplace authorities. On the contrary, he is in search of new pieces of information to find and highlight, a purpose that remarkably leads him to come back to the full text version of Orosius. The Orosius had already been exploited by Isidorus and by Bede. Victor Vita's absence is all the more striking, since we know that Ado read his History of the Persecutions when he wrote his martyrology, the evidence lies in a manuscript I discovered thanks to Jean Berger, who is a doctor in medieval history from my university, who understood the importance of the Codex Narde in Brussels when he realized that it contains the unique copy of Ado's Martyrology in its primitive form. The manuscript is very close to Ado indeed. A scribe has added Ado's obit within the Martyrology, and it is the only addition. In the same manuscript, the history written by Victor Vita received the closest possible reading, with the master pointing to a reader to which sentence he has to pay attention. But there is absolutely no evidence of any use of the same history in the Chronicle. In fact, there is no more evidence of Ado using Gregory of Tours, nor the Annales Metanzas Priores, nor the Vita Caroli, even if Ado knew it. And the reason why seems quite easy to guess. Ado selects every fact that he can assign to a specific date. He keeps names and events in his chronicle, provided that he can quote them with respect to its essential chronological structure. Hence, his choice of narratives with a solid and explicit chronological frame. Orosius and the De Viris Illustribus perfectly meets this requirement. When we read Orosius, we are stricken by the heavy rhetorical intent, by the desire to persuade the reader of the essential right, goodness, fairness of Christianity. But Ado does not read Orosius in this way. He skips all the theoretical passages, all the moral and religious lessons, and keeps battles, names, places, people, every piece of news he can date, for dates are his tools for connecting events. Just look at this sample about the Emperor Hadrian's reign. In brackets I put from which text the information comes. The same observation applies to the De Viris Illustribus. We read it as a who's who, as a kind of biographical dictionary of Christian aristocracy or intellectuals, but for Ado, it is a huge database of names with dates. For Jerome and Gennadius after him indicates who was emperor when this glorious author died, or who was the master of this important bishop, or who was his opponent during this council. If I keep only the 14 first names that Ado selects in the De Viris Illustribus, it is 14 among 65 names, you can notice that it does not strictly follow the chapter's order. Ado arranges the order to recover the chronological order from Hadrian to Diocletianus. And it chooses only people explicitly connected to a chronological marker. He has already done such a job. If we look back at this personal manuscript I've just alluded to, it shows a historical sketch that begins with a celebration of Cyprianus of Carthage, that leads to a biography of Eugenius of Carthage under the Vandal rules, a historical and ecclesiastical continuity that seems then to inspire the copy of details about Vandals' presence in Africa, here borrowing from Bede. The chronological order is poorly kept from our point of view, but the method is obviously there. The now know-how is certainly a thrilling aspect of Ado's work, but I want to give also a chance to the question why, even if I did not want to begin with it. Why such a huge job? if not to please the king, not to flatter chauvinistic feelings, not to respond to any comment. Ado has complacently answered Girard of Vienne demand when Girard was looking for relics and texts to accompany and authentify them. But for the Chronicon, we have absolutely no clue about any aristocratic comment or reception. There are two very striking traits in the Chronicons that can help us deciding why, that is probably for whom, has Ado written. The first is the exegetical discourse that takes an important place at the beginning of the Chronicon. The second is the care Ado takes to warn against heresies. As you have probably noticed, the biblical ages, that is the first line, the biblical ages let quite an important room to exegesis. Rabanus Maurus appears in turquoise and Quod Vuldeus Carthaginensis in bright purple. Quod Vuldeus was a bishop of Carthage, and at the beginning of the 5th century, his book on God's promises and predictions enumerates the promises that the scriptures contain and connects them to their historical fulfillments. The treaty also points which predictions still wait for their realization. Quod Vuldeus therefore offers a systematic textbook to teach how to read the scriptures, but also God's visible action in human history. Ado's use of this late antique treaty is really innovative and unexpected if we consider the very scarce dissemination of Quod Vuldeus' work. It is far less surprising when one understands that the best-known manuscript of Quod Vuldeus is actually an unseen Viennensis manuscript or a Lyonese manuscript with very tight links with Ado. As Jean Berger again has noticed it, this is the dear colleague who gave me the picture, Sevilla Bibliotheca Colombinais Valensis 101 contains a very hagiographical dossier that Ado composed for Girard of Vienne. The same dossier as in the manuscript now in Brussels. Obviously, Ado paid a great deal of attention to Quod Vuldeus, whose treaty here stands thoroughly annotated. In the Chronicon, however, it does not copy this treaty line for line. It selects and rewrites to create a teaching about the mystery of the Church. The Church, explains Ado after Quod Vuldeus, is like Noah's Ark. It is made of wood, like the Holy Cross itself, for it gives life through the sacraments. The Ark as a door for the raven to go out and flee, because heretics have no place within the Church. The teaching is sound and clear, but not sufficient for Ado, who completes it with very long quotations of Rabanus Maurus. As you can quickly observe, the main theme of the Church is strongly developed. We must conclude that in his Chronicon, Ado does not repeat the major steps of the Old Testament for the sake of erudition. He uses biblical history according to a strict typology that leads to a strong profession of Catholic faith about the essential role of the Church in a history of salvation. Such a discourse could be a bit theoretical for lay audiences, but it fits perfectly the expectations and needs of clerics. And if we consider that Ado sings loudly about the mystery of the Church, and that at the same time he censors all the licentious or tendentious anecdotes, all the nice stories about the sexual misbehavior of Roman emperors and Frankish kings, we can be sure that he does not want his chronicon to give lessons to a lay audience, but rather to inform the clerics of his cathedral school. This is verified by the careful teaching Ado himself delivers on heresies on each occasion. When Jerome only alludes to a heretical teaching, Ado explains how inaccurate it is and why. He denounces any faulty treaty and warns against authors who were innocent for Jerome, but who Ado judges fallible. For instance, when the Annales Regni Francorum remember a synod held in Aachen in 809, Ado duly makes intelligible the issues raised by the meeting and their theological conclusions. Conclusions he underpins by a biblical quotation. What was a memorable event in the ARF becomes a fundamental teaching in the Chronicon. I like the time to elaborate further, but suffice it to say here that whenever Orosius, Bede, or Jerome allude to a heresy, Ado explains what it is and why it is a condemnable mistake. This is our time to conclude. Aha, looks familiar, doesn't it? To write his chronicle, Ado draws on a series of sources that he has chosen for complementary reasons. Bede, Orosius, Jerome are undisputed authorities, references that allow the reconstruction of a reliable account of the entire human past. Each is indeed trustworthy, but not complete alone. So Ado has also chosen them because they complement each other and can be brought together according to one of their common feature, that is a chronological structure. Such a structure is more or less apparent, obvious in the Annales, but rather implied in the Liber Historiae Francorum. So Ado's work has chiefly consisted in making visible all the chronological connections between events, thanks to his systematic use of the Christian era. When Orosius locates disasters and catastrophes under a consulate, when the Liber refers to a king and Isidorus to an annus mundi, Ado translates in datations Anno Domini. It is the universal benchmark suited to a universal history. Ado wants to provide education, but an education set upon deep knowledge about the history of salvation. He tells the story of the patriarchs and prophets, indicating for each of the character he names the symbolic meaning of his surname according to the Hebrew etymology. He places all the elements of the biblical story in the order in which they occurred, but does not forget to move from the literal to the allegorical sense of the scripture. The biblical history provides thus resembles an introduction to exegesis. The Chronicle of Ado demonstrates what a Carolingian intellectual, acting here as a bishop, that is, as a teacher does, expects from promising disciples and clerics in terms of historical culture. The program is ambitious, with very solid roots in the Roman pagan and Christian past and theological systematic lessons. Thanks to the fresque I began with, using hagiography as a revealer, we can now conclude that Ado is not creating something entirely new in the Carolingian era. It is rather materializing an intellectual project that underwent its way for 3 or 4 generations. Ado's Chronicon is a textbook that embodies a whole Carolingian effort to lay historical knowledge upon trustworthy written authorities, sorted according to the perfect order of the Christian era, encyclopedic, Roman, Orthodox knowledge about church history. Thank you.